Okay, here we are with another video tutorial, and in this video we're going to talk about how to take wireframes in a Photoshop file, a PSD file, and convert them into HTML and CSS markup. And we're going to achieve that in part by using the 960 grid system, the 960 CSS framework. That is going to provide some of the tools that we need to accomplish this, and we're also going to create from scratch some custom CSS to fill in all the gaps that the grid work, or the grid framework I should say, doesn't give us. So to begin with, let's take a look here at what we're working with in Photoshop. I have my wireframe document open, and we can see that as with all wireframes, it's comprised of a series of regions. Each of these regions is expressed as a rectangle on the page. Each region has its own label, and I'm using varying shades of gray to denote or connotate the different weights or importance of each of these regions. Now, if I turn my guidelines on inside of Photoshop, and I can do Command semicolon or Control semicolon on the PC to do that, you'll see my guidelines show up here, and they give us some indication of how everything is positioned here on the page. And as you can see, everything is occupying a certain number of columns. For example, my header and my navigation are both occupying 12 columns on the grid. My sidebar, on the other hand, is occupying exactly 4 columns. One thing we want to make sure of before we go from this step and convert this into markup is that each of our regions begins and ends on a full column. What I mean by that is if we come to our sidebar, as an example, and I'm going to come over to my sidebar, Command T or Control T to go into free transform mode, and I'm going to move it back to here and then confirm that. Okay, now my sidebar begins on a full column, but it ends on a gutter between columns, and that's a problem. We actually need this to end either on the previous guideline, so it ends on that column, or we can go ahead and extend it back out one additional column. Well, I know I don't want all this white space. I want to extend it one more column, so I'll go back into my free transform mode and pull it out here to the nearest full column. We want to make sure that's the case with all of our regions. Okay, with that set, we're ready to go ahead and start building this out using a combination of HTML and CSS. And to create the markup, we're going to use the same tool that we've used throughout our work, and that's Vim. And here I have Vim opened up. Now, I've created the 2 files that I need to accomplish this, an HTML file, and I've called it PSD2html.html, and a CSS file, which is called styles.css. Both of these files are empty, so we're starting from scratch. The PSD HTML file is in the root of my website, and we can see that here. It's under the htdocs folder. And styles, on the other hand, is inside of a CSS folder. That's important to make note of when it comes time to link these 2 files together. Okay? So we're going to start here by creating our basic HTML markup. And we're going to use the same basic template that we do for all of our code. So we begin with a doc type, and we're creating HTML5, so we'll use that doc type. Always have to start with an opening HTML tag. We immediately go into our head tag. I'm going to set the meta tag here and define the charset attribute. We'll set it to UTF-8. I'm going to give myself a title tag. So we know what the document is all about. Close the title tag. Remember, there's no closing meta tag. If you want to, you can certainly come in and add a / to the end of the opening tag, but it's not necessary in HTML5. After the title tag, we need to add a link to our CSS file. And we do that using the link tag. So that's a link. Now there are 3 attributes that we need to define when we link to CSS. The first one is the rel attribute, or the relation attribute. This basically describes what kind of content we're linking to. And in the case of CSS, we always want to use the value style sheet here. And then we define the type of content. And again, we always use the same value with CSS, and that is going to be text / CSS. And finally, last but not least, we defined the link, the actual path to the file we want to open. And we do that using the href attribute, just like on an A tag. So we say href equals, I know I have my file inside the CSS folder, so I'll say CSS/ and it's called styles.css. Okay. Once again, the link tag does not have a closing counterpart, and so we can just close it out here, or if we wanted to, we could add a space / to the end of that opening tag. Okay, I'm going to close out my head tag, open up the body tag, and since I know I'm going to have to add a closing body and a closing HTML tag, let's go ahead and do that first and foremost here. I'll go down a few lines and add those in. And now I'm ready to go ahead and start setting up my actual layout here. So let's save this before we get too far along. And let's just do a quick test. Oh, come back down here and do a quick test to make sure that this markup is going to be visible in my browser. And I'll come over to my browser, refresh the page. Okay, there it is. I also see my title showing up in the top of the browser, so that looks good. I'll come back here now into my HTML document. I'm going to select this. Because I'm in visual mode now in Vim, I can hit D, and that's going to delete that entire line there. And I'm going to hit I to go back into insert mode, and I'm going to add my first piece of markup to create my layout. Anytime we use the 960 grid system, we always have to include a container. And the container serves 2 purposes. First, it defines how many columns we want to use in our grid. I'm using a 12-column grid, and that's defined by my Photoshop file. I made that decision early on in the process. Second, this container is going to center whatever I create exactly in the middle of the browser. So typically, and as we can see in this very simple example here, my content is going to float to the left. Well, by using the container in the 960 grid system, I'm going to say my content is 960 pixels wide, it has 12 columns, and I want to center that right in the middle of the page. Okay, let's go ahead and add in the container, and then we have to go off and actually grab the 960 template files from 960.js because we haven't gotten those just yet. Let's start off with our container though. We're going to use the section tag, an HTML5 tag appropriate for this purpose, but somewhat generic, and we want to be specific when we use our HTML markup. So I'm going to add an ID to the section tag to give it a more specific descriptive label. And it's my main container, so I'm going to use main container as my value here. Now, here's the important part, and the part where we start to tap into the 960 framework. I'm going to give this a class, and I'm going to set it to container_12. I'm going to close out my section tag and put it right before the closing body tag. Now, the container_12 class is a class that's defined by the 960 framework. And what that class does is apply those 3 effects that we just described. It centers the content, makes it 960 pixels wide, and assumes we're going to use a 12-column grid on our site. In order to get all of that, though, we do have to download the 960 grid system framework files from the 960GS website. Let's go off and do that. So we'll come back to Firefox, open up a new tab, and go to 960.js, 960GS for grid system. And we're going to click on the big download button to grab those files. Now, the file we're downloading here actually contains quite a bit of different content, including various template files. You can see I've actually downloaded it a couple times here. I'll go ahead and open up my most recent download. Okay, and it's attempting to load here. Let's go ahead and open it up. We'll unzip the file. Okay, here we are down at the bottom, and sure enough, I have a couple copies of this, but that's okay. Okay, so here's all the content inside of the template file that we just downloaded. And as it turns out, we just want to go inside of the code folder inside of this directory, and then we just want to go inside of CSS. We don't need anything else. And even within CSS, we only need a few of these different files. We need 960.css, so we'll select that. We need reset.css, and we need text.css. That's all we need from this download in order to get the 960 grid framework working on our site. So let's copy those three files. I'm going to come into my htdocs folder, and I'm going to come into my CSS folder. There's the style sheet that I've created, but I haven't added anything to it yet. I'm going to paste those framework files right alongside of it in here. And there we go. So 960 reset and text. If we close this and hop back into Vim, you'll notice that right now we're only linking to our custom styles file, and we need to link to the others too. So I'm going to select this line in visual mode in Vim, Y copies in visual mode, P pastes or puts. And I actually want to put this on a new line. So let's add a new line, and then we'll paste that in. And another time, and one more time, because we have three new files that we want to bring in here. Let me go to the beginning of the line, and we'll add in our indentation here to keep everything nice and aligned. And then we're just going to update the names of our files. Now, very important, we want to make sure our custom style sheet is last. Otherwise, we can load these in any order. So I'm going to start with the 960. Let's delete that and add in 960. We'll make this our reset, and we'll make this one text. And then we can save that. Come back to our browser. I'll close the 960 website and let me refresh the page. Okay, well, we have nothing because I deleted the content. Let's put some content back in so we can get a rough sense of what we're working with now. So we'll put hello world back in, save the file, back in the browser and refresh. Okay, so not a whole lot happening yet, but you can see a couple things have changed. Different font, and that's coming from the text.css file. We've lost some of the margin at the top here. That's coming from the reset.css file. And you'll notice as I scrub out here and then come back in, we have this space hanging off to the side. And that actually signifies the fact that our content is indeed centered on the page. There's an equal space on the other side. Hard to see that now because we don't have a background color on our container, but we'll be changing that in just a little bit here. So far so good. We have our container underscore class, and again, this value right here, container underscore 12, is being supplied by the 960.css file. That's why we haven't needed to create any custom markup so far. And we'll keep going. So let's delete this line, and let's add an actual new line of code here that we want to use. And what we want to do now that we have our main container set up is create markup for each of the regions in our Photoshop file. So we come back to Photoshop and we see we have a header, we have a navigation area, a sidebar, main content, a footer. All of these sections are going to correspond to HTML tags. And because we're using HTML5, we have some great semantic tags that we can map against these regions. Header, for example, can be represented using, of course, the header HTML5 tag. Navigation can be handled with the nav tag, and so on. So we begin with the header, and we're going to just make our way down the document. Now, before we leave Photoshop, I need to make sure I know 3 things about the header. First, how many columns is it? Well, we have the answer to that. It's 12. Second, how high is it? How tall is it? Well, I don't have the answer to that. So to get it, let's come over to our header folder here. And from here, we can either type Command-T to go into free transform mode, or we can just type the U key. That's going to give us our height and width dimensions. So here we see, okay, it's 200 pixels tall, 12 columns, 200 pixels tall. And finally, I want to make note of the weight, the importance as represented by the background color here. Well, let me actually go ahead and select that background color using my eyedrop tool so I know exactly what it is. I'll come over to my swatch here. Okay, so there it is. It's 3C, 3C, 3C. I'm just going to make a quick note of that. Okay, with those 3 facts, well, one more thing we can note, the title is header. So with those 4 facts, we're ready to come over to our HTML and CSS documents and recreate that element. So we come over and we decided we're going to use a header tag that fits the section perfectly. If we didn't have a good fit, we could use a section tag and then give it an ID. We'll use the header tag though. No need to give this an ID because the tag itself already has a lot of good semantic value to it. We are going to add our class though, and we're going to begin with the container class, or I should say the version of the container class that we use inside of the container, and that is grid underscore. So this class, container underscore, only gets used one time on our outside container. Everything else is going to be grid underscore. And that's how we're going to define how many columns our region should take up. So if I use grid underscore 12, I'm saying that this region should span 12 columns. If I said grid underscore 6, that means the region should span 6 columns, or half the width of the page. Header goes straight across, so I'm going to make it 12. And you can see here why it doesn't work if our regions spill into the gutters, because there's no way to say add a gutter to it. Well, we want to express everything in columns. 1 column, 4 columns, 6 columns. That's why we don't stop or start on a gutter. Okay, so we say grid 12. Now, that takes care of the width, the number of columns. We still need to set the height, we need to set the background color, and we need to set the content inside. For the height and background color, we're going to add a couple of custom classes. And we're going to use a very basic notation. We'll say height underscore, followed by the pixel value of the height. And in this case, it's 200. For weight, we're going to use a similar convention. We'll say weight underscore, followed by a numeric value. And let's see how many weights I have. 1, 2, 3. Looks like there are 4 different weights in this layout. I'm going to say weight 1 is the most important. It's this darker shade of gray. Weight 2 is going to be my next darkest shade, and so on. So we come back to them. We're going to say this is weight 1, our darkest shade of gray. And we're going to close out the class, close out the opening tag. We'll come down a line, and to add the content, I'm going to put it inside a paragraph tag, a very typical kind of thing to do. This is going to give me some flexibility in terms of adding padding to my text. If I added padding to the header tag itself, it's actually going to expand the width and or the height of the header tag, which could break the grid. Very simple solution. I create a tag inside of header and I apply my padding changes to that. P is the perfect tag to use to hold some text, because in some ways this is a paragraph of text. I add in the content, it's simply header, close it out, and I save the page. And before we do anything else, let's come back to Firefox and see what we have. We'll refresh here. Okay, well, Our test content has been replaced with header, but we don't see anything else just yet. And that's because even though we've added two new classes, height underscore 200 and weight underscore 1, we haven't actually defined what those classes do. And that's why we have our custom styles.css file. So let's go over there and let's go ahead and enter in the height class first. It is a class, so I start with a dot inside my CSS file, underscore 200. And in this class, I simply want to set the height of the element to 200 pixels. Height, colon, space, 200 px. No space between the 200 and the px. And then we put a semicolon on the end. Come down here, close that out. Okay, how about the weight? We have weight underscore 1. And here, I want to set the background color. Background color is my CSS property. The value is going to be that value that we jotted down earlier, 3C, 3C, 3C. Again, we use a semicolon to end the line, and we close out the rule with a closing curly brace. Okay, we save that file, come back to our browser and refresh. Okay, now we're making some headway. We have a region spanning the right number of columns with a background color in place that makes that very clear. We can see the height, and we have some text in there. Now, two issues with the text. One is you can't see it because the text color is so close to the background color, so there's not enough contrast. Second, I'd like to make a little bit of padding here so that the text isn't right up against the edge of this region. So we're going to come into our markup here, and we're going to define our p tag. So let's deal with the padding. We'll put that on that p tag there as we planned, and we'll say, let's say we do 20 pixels of padding all the way around. We'll do a good amount of padding on that. Meanwhile, under our weight 1, we're going to have the same problem with all our weight 1 regions because that background color is so dark. So this is where we want to add color, and we're going to set it to white, which is simply hashtag FFF, semicolon. Save that, come back to our browser, refresh. Okay, now we're making some progress. We can see our label, we've added some padding to it, and we have our first region set up. Okay, that's going to wrap up this tutorial, and in the next one we're going to go through and create the rest of the regions here in the layout, including when we come down to the sidebar and we hit one that only spans 4 columns. So stay tuned for that, and otherwise that's a start on doing a PSD to HTML CSS conversion.